I said, hey, man.
What did you say?
Yes, this is a different name. It's a dog's breath. This is Nicole. That's George.
So if you take a look at whole speech, and I realize from an eye test, Amanda's not going to be able to read words, and I can't even read the words from right here, but you can certainly see, okay, the cast down your bucket thing is certainly dominating in this area of the speech, and then it's certainly coming up again in this area, but there are a lot more areas that it is not included in, and he makes a constant reference to it over and over again. So certainly that would be one thing to take a look at. But what else is he doing, and what's the main message that he's trying to communicate in your mind throughout the speech? Because he's really kind of teetering some lines between arguing a point, but also not trying to upset too many people and rock the boat if we're going to continue to go with the cast down your bucket.
So give us a hand and we'll do the rest.
Okay, yeah, like give us a chance, give us an opportunity.
I think his message is if you ever go sailing, make sure you have a bucket.
I think he's going a little bit more than that with it, but
You think more than that? You think?
JT, did you have?
Yeah.
Like, what does he acknowledge is a mistake for people of his race to demand right off the bat? Okay, yeah. So, you know, early on, and he makes reference to line 13, not only this, but the opportunity here afforded will awaken among us a new era of industrial progress. Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life we began at the top instead of the bottom, looking for a seat in Congress, you know, as opposed to trying to work within industrial skill, real estate, and things along those lines. He then kind of switches it to, all right, at line 58, what does he say? It is at the bottom of life that we must begin and not at the top. And then I think also, you know, the last part of his speech kind of gets forgotten about a little bit when you get to the backside of it. Line 144, the opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house. And certainly this rubs a lot of people the wrong way. It's not easy to say, at the bottom we must begin. And you could argue it's not right to say at the bottom that we must begin. But he is certainly going to, especially from the north, where you do have more radical, and in some ways I guess you could argue militant ideas being thrown out, that this must be taken. We have to be at the same place. He's saying at the bottom, let us kind of work our way up. So that's kind of his general message. Give us that hand, that opportunity to kind of show our worth.
I think he's trying to say that even if they are free, that they're not like terrible people. They're still. I forget where he says it, but it's like we proved our loyalty to you in the past or something. Yeah.
Right around like in line 80, and it continues to go on down here for a little bit.
Like they would be like good neighbors.
While doing this, you can be sure in the future, as in the past, that you and your families will be surrounded by the most patient, faithful, law-abiding, unresentful people that the world has seen. We've proved our loyalty to you in the past in nursing your children, watching by the sickbed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them tear-dimmed eyes to their graves. So in the future, in our humble way, we can stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach. Which this last part here is significant because he mentions that no foreigner can approach. What idea does he bring forth at the beginning of this paragraph? What two groups is he looking at? Not just black and white. He's looking at immigrants, because keep in mind, it's late 1800s going into early 20th century. You have a lot of, European immigrants coming in. Those of you that read The Jungle for independent reading certainly are aware of that. So while a lot of immigrants are coming in and are looking to, certainly begin working and whatnot, who should be a group of people that you look at? People who are right here. He mentions this one where you talk about faithful, law-abiding, certainly a much more of an emotional appeal. But up here he does a different kind of appeal. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, built your railroads and cities, and brought treasures forth from the bowels of the earth, and helped make possible this magnificent representation of the progress of the South. You kind of have a couple of appeals taking place. Down here, what's he doing? Loyal, faithful, law-abiding, humble. Probably more of an. Yeah, it could be. I'd say more of an emotional pathos. I think together you kind of get the ethos coming from it. This one is much more logical or kind of practical in the work that we have done. Now, these can also be two pretty uncomfortable examples. Because where is he getting his data from? Slavery. And there's certainly a difference between being a slave and being a person who wants to certainly do these things. There wasn't a whole lot of option when this was taking place 30, 40, 50 years before. But his argument is you have experience with us. Might not all be positive experience, especially from the African American community, but you have this incoming segment of the population with the immigrants that's a great variable you don't know anything about. Hey, why don't you go with us? So here, when he says cast down your bucket, who's he saying cast it down to? To the whites, cast it down. You need workers, we have it. How many? Because he throws out numbers. Says 8 million, and then he gets the 60. You have 16 million hands here who can certainly do things. So he's certainly throwing those numbers out, where you get 8 million here, and then on the back is when he makes reference to nearly 16 millions of hands, and then he also kind of goes into fractions, where what does he start going with?
He said 1/3.
1/3 of the population. So you got a third of the people here who can either elevate it or we can bring it down. Potentially if it gets ignored. So there's certainly some statistical approach that he is absolutely, keep going with it, that he's bringing forth over and over and over again. But you take a look in that second column, he addresses with the cast down your bucket to those of the white race. Who is he addressing the first time? He uses it in the first column. No, he's not talking to the ship lost at sea.
But it's a connection between
Well, and that's where he's making his, if we were going to call this a device, extended metaphor, because he's making this metaphor with the ship, cast down your bucket, it's lost at sea. You have the ability to certainly survive right here, just cast down your bucket into the water and you'll be okay. But you take a look at line 34, to those of my race who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with the southern white man, who is their next door neighbor, I would say, cast down your bucket where you are. So over here, he is talking to those of his own race, and then over here, he's talking to those of the opposite race, appealing to both. So there's that same metaphor. So not only could you say it's extended metaphor, and some people might go with repetition taking place as well, because he mentions it quite a bit, but there's certainly a sense of parallelism, parallel structure, maybe not in a syntactical way with those two examples, but what he says to one group of people, he also therefore says to the other group of people. And you think about it, when you go into those of my race, it is not an easy time living in the South still at this period. You certainly have a lot of segregation, discrimination, Jim Crow laws. We already talked about Plessy versus Ferguson before a letter from Birmingham jail. Legal segregation is coming down the pike, very, very quickly. But he's saying, stay where you are, don't leave. We need to build relationships here and now that are going to be mutually beneficial. And he drives that home with one more metaphor around line 92.
They could be his fingers. Yeah, one is the hand and all things.
What's he saying? Because this can also rub people the wrong way.
They can work separately. His fingers become one hand.
You got 5 fingers on a hand. Thing works together as a hand, but in all things social, we can be as separate as the fingers. So we don't, and again, he's basically going, we don't have to have equal representation in all things. We don't have to be necessarily treated the same in all things. But when it comes to mutually benefiting both races, both parties, that's when we can work together as a hand. But if other ways do we need to be separate as fingers, then that's the way it needs to be. So, not that he is saying segregation is good, but he's certainly not cutting the head off of that snake and stomping on it. He's basically going, if that's what we need to do for now, then that's what we need to do. But we need to kind of build our way up. Is it the appropriate approach? I don't feel like that's for me necessarily to say. In his circumstances, he feels that it would be the best. Certainly, though, you can see where some folks would not be so happy. Our greatest danger is that in the leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us who live by the production of our hands and fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and put brains and skill into the common occupations of life. And this is a phrase that he tends to use multiple times, prosper in proportion, prosper in proportion. If you are going to prosper, you need to put in the work. And work is where he feels that the chance exists for African Americans to gain recognition. I wouldn't say equality, but recognition, and then his hope would be over time that would start to manifest into something a little bit greater. It's a speech. If it's a speech, how do you make people take note to some things that you were saying? Repetition, alliteration, those kinds of things. Dylan, what'd you say?
Pausing.
Yeah, and in this part we don't necessarily know when those pauses might have happened, but you do see a fair amount of alliteration that would take place. The P's are getting used quite a bit. Inexperienced, ignorant. Instead at the bottom, people thought they kind of began at the top. If you are dealing with the speech, certainly that syntax area is something that you always want to look at. Again, alliteration, parallel structure, things like that, because they don't have a text in front of them. So if you're really trying to drive home some points, you tend to repeat it over and over and over again. So anytime you're dealing with speech, that's something that you certainly want to be aware of. Some of you might have already read chapter 1, some of you aren't there yet, but after you read chapter 1, you should be going, hey, that seems like Booker T. Washington idea there. And as I said, if at the end of chapter 1 you don't see it, then you want to kind of go back and revisit those pages a little bit. I'm eating it now, so it's down below. Your speech you still need. Tomorrow, you're not doing a TWA, so don't worry about that. And you're still going to be able to work together. But you're going to pick one of your devices that you've looked at, or maybe something we haven't discussed, and you're going to do a practice paragraph with it. So you certainly do need to have your speech with you tomorrow. I just have some guidelines that you're going to have to follow for your paragraph, which are meant to be helpful. But now that we're kind of advancing along, maybe some other little kind of tips and ideas that would be a good idea to keep in mind for, whether it be like TWA or even a take-home essay like Flannery O'Connor, might still be able to use. Wednesday, you're going to get another document, W.E.B. Du Bois. He is a little critical of Mr. Washington and his Atlanta address, and he's the one who coins the phrase the Atlanta Compromise.